So, hello and welcome to another episode of Art of Science. I'm your host, Graham Ambrose, and Art of Science is a quarterly interview podcast that coincides with issues of Policy Studies Journal. And before we get started, if you're listening, just a reminder to rate, review, and subscribe. Today, I'm very excited to have two guests with us. Dr. Mallory SoRelle is an assistant professor of public policy at Duke University, and Dr. Delphia Shanks is an assistant professor in the Department of Politics at Hendrix College. In the February issue of PSJ, they'll be publishing or have a paper in the issue called The Policy Acknowledgement Gap, explaining misrepresentation of government social programs. And at a very high level, kind of alluded to in the title itself, it addresses the gap of Americans who actually benefit from government social programs and who actually reports being in a social program. And in the findings themselves, which I think is very interesting, we see that there's 91% of respondents that report benefiting from these programs, but we only see that 41% acknowledge that they're actually using government social programs. And Dr. SoRelle and Shanks argue that this comes down to kind of the delivery. So thinking about the means tested versus non-means tested, as well as visibility and these kind of submerged politics. It comes down to definition and what people understand to be government social programs. And finally, thinking about the desirability, the social and partisan desirability of such programs. So with that, again, thank you both for being here. I'm excited to talk about this paper. And I was curious if you guys kind of want to step off from there, kind of digging in further into kind of the paper and the results.
Sure. Mallory, do you want to start?
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, as Graham's already said, right, the big picture in this, we're really exploring why it is that people who use government social programs, which is almost all of us, don't often acknowledge benefiting from such programs when you ask them, particularly in a kind of broad way. And that has a lot of implications for democratic accountability and politics. People aren't going to go out and try and convince policymakers to expand government spending or things like that if nobody thinks they're actually benefiting from any of that spending. And so, in this paper, we're drawing from, our starting point really was the submerged state literature and the idea that how visible a policy is shapes whether or not people acknowledge benefiting from government. But we delve more into the sort of social policy literature broadly to think about all of the various things that might influence how people think about the ways that government helps them. And in particular, we were interested in trying to take some of the theories that have maybe been tested in using sort of cross-sectional data and think about sort of an experimental approach to seeing whether any of these explanations for why people don't really see government at work in their lives, like whether there are different types of information that can overcome those, right? So not only, do we know what explains this, but also can you change any of it? So that was really kind of the impetus, I think, behind this. And I think the short answer is we find that pretty much all of the explanations seem to be at work. And there's some degree of moving people when you try and overcome some of the obstacles, like how visible a policy is, whether people really understand what a government social program is, sort of whether they feel some element of shame around using them or things like that. But that there are definitely some hard scope conditions on who can be moved and how much. Delphia, you have stuff to add to that?
Yeah, I think one of the things that was particularly interesting to us is that this be a useful paper, right? That we are able to sort of take what we learn from this and use it when we're thinking about how to make change in the world. And so for it to be a complex answer is both frustrating because it's like, no, there's not a silver bullet. And also, I think gives us some faith that in fact we're capturing and working with a really complex issue. And that one of the things I like about it is that means you can't ignore certain parts of it because they're all at play. And I also appreciated knowing that defining a program helps, but just providing information is not going to move people substantially towards acknowledging their own usage and the role of government in their lives. And I think that helps. I think that's an important point.
Yeah. I would add one other thing. One of the most interesting findings to me in this paper, I think, really gets at the sort of larger debate we have in political science and in sort of policy process research about the way that partisan polarization maybe changes the game a little bit and how we think about accountability and public opinion and sort of policy design and all of these things. And so one of the most interesting findings to me in this paper is when we're asking people, we ask people if you've ever used a government social program, right? We use a number of different experimental techniques to see if information can shift the answer to that. But we ask some other follow-up questions because we're not just interested in how people evaluate their own policy use. We want to know if they're processing that new information in other ways. So for example, we ask people whether they think each of a handful of different types of programs count as a social program, which is one way of saying, has the information we've given you actually changed the way you understand this, even if it doesn't change the way you answer the question about yourself? And so one of the most fascinating things to me, which suggests that the information that we were providing does actually shift how people think about this until it runs up against that sort of wall of partisan identity, is one of the policies we ask people about whether they think it's a government social program is the earned income tax credit, which is sort of a submerged policy delivered through the tax system. And when we look at Republicans specifically, and not only Republicans, but Republicans who themselves report using the EITC, those who are introduced to the information treatments that define a social program or sort of unsubmerge the tax delivery mechanisms, were more likely to say, oh yeah, EITC is a government social program. And they still were unwilling to say that they had used a government social program, even though we know they used this particular program that they just told us is a government social program. And so that was one of the most interesting takeaways to me about the complexity that Delphia was talking about, is like people are processing information in complicated and interesting ways when it comes to thinking about how they interact with government.
And to build off this, I feel like, I don't know if surprising is the right word, but it was incredibly interesting, right? To see, I think there's like 3 or 4 kind of statements made by Republicans that are, I think, to the question of like, how do you see government programs? And they're all like, I work hard, I don't need to use them. Or, like welfare, depravity. I mean, all of these components, and all lining up against what you had just said, right? Of they acknowledge that they did use a social program, but still this like connotation to what social programs mean to them is kind of at odds, even what they're saying or reporting beforehand. So I thought that part of the paper was incredibly fascinating. Of you build all the way up to something, and then still ask this final question, and it kind of plays out, as you say, in partisan lines. So yeah, incredibly interesting. I guess one additional thing, so talking about kind of where these thoughts come from and where, the specific paper comes from, I wonder if you could talk about, is there past research or kind of past questions that led into the current questions that you're asking in this paper? And just thinking about this kind of, not as a snapshot of one paper, but this kind of broader timeline.
Delphia, do you want to talk about the past research?
I mean, yeah, I can talk about the past research, although, Mallory, I feel like I'm about to sort of out us a little bit here. So we were in graduate school together, and Suzanne Mettler was both of our advisors. And so I feel like in graduate school, we were steeped in this literature and this approach. And
we were submerged in it, you might say.
Oh, I should have gotten that one. And well, we weren't, because we could see it, right? So we knew it was happening to us. So anyway, besides the point. So I think for us, we were like, oh, this is an important and key part of American politics and the study of political science. And so a lot of the work we had done was on how policy shapes future political possibilities. And we were really curious about, okay, so what are the implications for increasing amount of policy that's being passed through submerged pathways, right, through the tax code. And we thought, if this is one way that Congress is getting past partisan gridlock, then this is a really important thing for us to be understanding, because we definitely do not want to be in a position, or it has really important implications, like Mallory said, for democracy if we continue to provide benefits and government is doing things in ways that people don't acknowledge. So that is not about previous studies. That, I guess, is more about sort of the broad approach. But in particular, the previous literature that was focused on this, how groups mobilize around particular policy designs, and that makes them both more likely to mobilize or less likely to mobilize, and how those specific aspects were really shaping people's identities and resources. And I think that was key to both of us as we were looking into this and getting started.
Yeah, and so, I mean, beyond the sort of scholarly literature, the sort of other origin story of this, right, is, you know, Delphia and I shared a TA office, good old B11.
Yep.
And
mini donut.
Yeah, we were reflecting on this conversation. We both have similar memories of this. I've been thinking for a little bit about some of the policy feedback literature, and also about the way partisanship, which has become a more, which has become a piece of the policy feedback literature that people are engaging with more now. But at the time, was less the case. And so I was thinking a little bit about this concept of kind of like, is there partisan desirability bias in the way people think about policies, in the way something like the submerged state might be acting? And I remember talking to Delphia about this idea of like, could you test for something like that? And that, I think, really was the starting point of like, well, what could we do? And what are some other questions we might want to ask? But it was thinking about this partisanship piece very specifically.
Well, and it was also interesting because it had come out of work that Suzanne and another graduate student were working on at the time. And we were like, oh, this is a recent finding. This is different than what we know else. And I remember Mallory being like, I mean, what's the mechanism? And I was like, huh. That, you know, and it just started this conversation a long time ago.
Yeah.
So I guess starting from a conversation in a grad bay, I guess how is like the ideas or the literature that you've produced kind of stepwise moved up to this, or are you like remembering this conversation and reaching out and trying to, chase down this old flame, if you will? I'm just curious how, the story in between kind of that first ideation and kind of this project, this paper, if you could walk potentially through that, that'd be wonderful.
Yeah. Well, so there's.
I was gonna say, this is a great story, but I think Mallory tells it really well.
What I was saying, I think there's the like intellectual development of the paper, and then there's the actual development of writing the paper, and those are two different stories, right? And so the intellectual development, I would say, in some ways, it is both different and actually very similar from where we started, which is we started with this idea of mechanisms and submerged state literature, and just like this idea of acknowledging policy more broadly.
Yeah.
And, we did like what you're supposed to do. We went to the literature and we said, well, what are explanations that people have for these? And we kind of tried to group them into some nice frameworks, and how we grouped them changed a little bit over time. I don't know that the substance did, but sort of the organization did. And we sort of came up with these three broad categories of sort of delivery, definition, and desirability. And that last one, that desirability, kind of includes a bunch of moving parts in it.
Do you remember us trying to come up with these three words?
Yes.
Like, how can we make them memorable but distinct?
Yeah. We hung on that alliterative piece a lot.
We really did.
but the basic concepts of, is it about people's understanding? Is it about the visibility? Or is it about some iteration of desirability bias? Those were really there from the start. And the experimental design was intended to test those things from the start. Now, we did a pretest in 2016, and then made some choices to keep some and add some when we did the final in 2017. And, I think, for example, there were some things that I don't know that we anticipated using as much as we ended up doing. So we added this open-ended probe that you, Graham, were sort of referencing earlier. That was in the design from the beginning, but I don't know that we knew quite what to expect from it. And it actually ended up being really fruitful in the final analysis.
Well, and I think that's actually one of the ways that our design changed from the pre-test into our final, was that we thought, oh, this probe was actually much more useful and meaningful than we expected. And so we changed some of the other follow-ups. Like we were trying to do some sort of list experiment, and that didn't quite work or pan out to get what we wanted. And so that's when we asked for those sort of 2 higher level thinking questions about what percentage of Americans do you think use a social policy program, and then the check to make sure that they were understanding that the information had actually that they had processed it and updated their understanding of what a government social program was with the list of 5 programs.
Yeah. So I mean, in that sense, the ideas for what we were doing did not substantively change from beginning to end. Now, the process of the paper took some time, right? So we started talking about this in 2016, and in my, I think, last year at Cornell.
Yeah.
And we did the pretest. We presented a poster at APSA of those pretest results.
And then there was like the job market.
Yeah. And then I went on the job market and started a new job. And you were sort of moving into the dissertation writing phase.
Yeah.
And we collected the final, we still kept moving forward though, right? Like we collected the data that's in the paper in the summer of 2017. And I think actually we presented a paper version of it not that long after. So we had a full draft of a version of this paper with most of the analysis done probably by 2018. And then I think actually then what happened is we were sitting at an APSA talking about a different paper idea, and we were like, we should do that. And then we did. And we wrote another paper together and kind of published it aside and published it, and it went really quickly. And then I was trying to write a book, and you were trying to get a job and finish a dissertation. And then there was, I don't know if you remember this, a global pandemic, and I moved jobs. And so 2020 rolled around, and we were like, hey, remember that paper that's almost done? Maybe we should finish that. And we came back to it, and after, a few fits and starts of trying to remember what in the world we had been doing and where we were in the code and all of that, we did eventually get it finished and get it out.
Yeah. I will say, I mean, Mallory, I might push back just a little bit and say that I think we did have the one component that I think we added sort of later as part of our intellectual development, or the idea of this, was the idea of racialized identities being a really key and important driver of particularly democratic responsiveness, or Democrats, I should say, responsiveness. And I do think that was sort of the piece that was not finalized in about 2018, which I think is a really important piece, and which I'm really proud that we included, because I think it reflects where political science should be paying a lot of attention. So.
And I think we had both been working on other projects where that was a sort of prominent feature, and that certainly shaped our thinking around wanting to highlight that piece more.
Yeah.
And I think initially we'd gone back and forth a little bit on it because the sample size just made it tougher to racialized identity.
Because go ahead. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, because, we oversampled on young people, and we also oversampled on folks with incomes less than 35,000. And so it would have, I don't know that going back would have made sense for us to add like a third oversample in that way, but it was too bad that we did not have sample size large enough to be able to make more conclusive findings with that.
Yeah.
Or have more conclusive findings. I mean, we were very thoughtful about, like making sure we had enough power to test the things we were on, and then, your ideas change and grow, and the things that are important to you, you want to include those as well. Yeah. That change over time.
So I guess this exact point, right? So the paper in some ways sat as, I would say, you kind of changed in your interests. I think the world kind of changed in what it was thinking and what it was interested in. Outside of the kind of racialization stuff, is there kind of any other components that you saw kind of like really develop in what would have been the paper if it came out in 2018 compared to it coming out in 2023? I'm curious just how maybe in some ways with the same data, there's a different story that ends up coming out of the kind of story.
That's a good question.
Yeah. I mean, it wouldn't have been written completely in 2018. I will say this. I do think, on the one hand, I do wish we had just, in some ways, just like finished it earlier.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I think because we came back to it so many times, we went through a lot of different iterations, almost with fresh eyes.
Yeah.
Around the organization of it, because there are, right, as Delphia sort of mentioned earlier, there are a lot of complicated moving parts in this, and it makes it hard to talk about in a cohesive way. And I think one of the benefits actually of taking the time that we did is that we went through a lot of different iterations of how to organize our thoughts and write about them. And I think what we came up with now is a much clearer articulation of the concepts and ideas and results that we wanted to talk about in a way that I don't know that's where we would have landed in 2018.
It is nice to look at it and think, wow, I'm really happy with the progression of this paper and how I feel like we were able to do a really good job clearly writing about, because I think it's really hard. But I'm very happy with how the writing finally came out.
Yeah.
I think one additional thing, so you both kind of brought up the kind of pre-sampling and then kind of reframing your instrument. Could you just kind of talk through that? Like, what were you originally looking for? What were the reasons why it changed? I think that'd be incredibly helpful to hear kind of that thought process if you're willing to work through it.
Yeah, so my recollection is that the pretest more or less had exactly the experimental setup that is in the final version of the paper. There may have been some moderate tweaks, but I think it's pretty much the same. The difference is that we had a list experiment in the pretest because we were thinking about desirability bias. And so, right, that's one way you can try to capture that. And I think my recollection is that we decided the list experiment just didn't really add anything for, right, this is a world of scarcity and we had concrete resources. So we knew there was kind of a finite sample size we could have. And so adding an extra experiment, we did not think was worth the sort of reduction in power across the treatments that we cared more about. And so we took that out because it gave us more power in the sort of primary experimental groups, which allowed us to do some of the subgroup analysis that I'm really glad we were able to do.
Yeah.
That was one choice we made.
Yeah. I also think that when we were doing our analysis that we were realizing we actually couldn't tease out whether people had a new understanding, like that, whether they actually process intellectually now what we mean by a definite, like when we define the term government social program. So we didn't actually have a way to measure, was that meaningfully changing people, and double check that's what that was. So we added that in. And I think we were also just curious, like, is this a situation where we think, oh, it's about but not about me, it's about other people, so we wanted to add in, like, are you able to, what percentage of people with this broader definition do you think use government social programs? So I think that those allowed us to sort of more directly test what we realized we weren't able to examine in the first round. I will also say that two things. One, we met weekly with a writing group of outside folks who were like constantly giving us feedback. And so I feel like we had a pretty good research design or survey design headed in. But then the second thing is that Mallory is really, really good at precision. And so I feel like working with Mallory gave me a leg up on having a really good research design and survey before we even did our pretest. So, I know that this is maybe a later question, but my advice to people would be find someone who's very good at what they do and try to work with them.
Well, and I would say similarly, I think particularly when we started this project, you were a methods minor. Yeah. So you, I think, brought to the table questions that I would not have thought to ask about some of the way we were going to be doing the analysis that were really fruitful.
Yeah.
So I guess we can kind of dig into that a little bit more. We can think about constructing instruments and then how do we test the data that comes out of it. And I think that is like a pretty fruitful conversation, especially with younger scholars. So I'm just curious if you can kind of talk through maybe particularly this process, but more broadly, how do you, when setting up a new project, think through, okay, well, how am I going to get the data and how am I going to analyze that data? Because I think those are the fundamental questions that then, in my own experience, end up kind of blowing up somewhere in the middle, and then you're scrambling to do something with what's left. But I'm curious if you two have thoughts about kind of when thinking about research, how to kind of think through those two kind of critical components.
Yeah.
So I will say two things. I will say, generally speaking, I think tend to be someone who I really value starting from a puzzle. And thinking really thoughtfully about what my hypotheses are before I figure out what my design is going to be. Right? I do generally try to step through that process in that order. I will also say this paper is a little bit unusual for me, and actually, Delphia, I think for you as well, in that we both do pretty multi-method work. So it's in some ways unusual to have like a standalone project that it really only uses one type of analysis. And actually, even then, we kind of cheated, right? Because we have the open-ended responses. So like there's a smidge of qualitative data in there. So often when I am thinking about research design, I am thinking about it in the context of questions that don't lend themselves to existing data. So, a lot of my work is around consumer finance, and there are not existing sources of data that ask questions about finance and politics in the same instrument. A lot of the work that I've done is also historically oriented. And so I almost always find myself in a position where my research design is some sort of triangulation, right? There is no perfect causal inference design that I can come up with for the types of questions that I'm typically asking. And so it is usually, what are the things I can combine so that when they all tell you the same story, you will believe me? And so maybe that's, interviews, maybe that's collecting original survey data, maybe it's experiments, maybe it's archival work. Usually it's a combination of all of those. So that everything is kind of demonstrating the same trend, even if we can't find one specific design that is like, sort of your perfect little causal inference. I'm happy doing that kind of work. I think it lends itself really well to certain types of project. Like books are easier to write with that than papers. It lends itself to certain audiences over others, but I generally tend to be driven more by the question than by the data. and so I would rather figure out a research design that works for the thing I really want to answer than answer a question that is driven by the thing I can do in a particular way.
That's interesting because I feel like, one, this is something that when you and I walked through this together, for this project, I was like, oh, now I'm understanding, because I was still pretty early in my graduate career. I mean, at that point, and now I'm understanding what this means, and so to sort of have your hypotheses and then have a research design to test that. And I think this was the first time when I understood like how clearly and precisely that could be done. But the other thing I'll say is that, having said that, that is not, I don't think, how we approached our paper that we ended up writing super quickly together.
That's true.
Where we were both like, oh, we have these interesting questions we're asking, and this data would be complementary, and we could answer a question together we cannot answer individually if we do it this way. And so in that way, it was more of like a synergy. I wouldn't say it was data driven, but I would say that our question came and we were able to then figure out because of our different areas of expertise, how we could work together to figure out the answer to this question. And what was I going to say? Oh, the other thing, because Mallory said everything beautifully, the thing that I don't think I valued enough and still struggle with is that I am very much someone who wants things to be perfect before I do the thing. And there is so much value in like iteration being fast, and also like, okay, you don't have to run a pretest. You can literally just give this to the 3 people sitting next to you and be like, what questions do you have? Oh, okay. And use that immediate feedback to revise really meaningfully. And I think for me, because Mallory and I are different people, I find it incredibly helpful to learn what assumptions I am making about the tools I am creating based on a quick and dirty implementation several times or through several iterations, in a way that I think is different maybe than the way Mallory approaches things.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Though I will say, I do think, I mean, you sort of alluded to this earlier, Delphia. One of the things that has been, I think, a benefit to both of us, we started a writing group with another colleague of ours in, I think it was my fourth or fifth year of grad school.
It was definitely during graduate school.
Yeah, we still meet every day. We still meet every week to this day. So, and we exchange small pieces of writing. And a lot of what we have done over the years has been feedback on research designs, like on experimental protocols or survey protocols or things like that. And so, I think when you talk about sort of getting feedback on bits and pieces along the way, like that's been really instrumental, I think, to all 3 of us in that group.
Yeah.
For, across years and multiple projects. And so I think you're absolutely right about like having opportunities for that type of feedback and reflection and revision.
And I think it's nice to have the outside, feedback, but it's so nice to have a group of people who have seen you do things before and be like, oh, remember when you did that thing? Or, this is not what you're getting at because I've been with your projects long enough to understand that I think you're conceptualizing this thing a little bit differently than how you're measuring it here. And that I think is really important or helpful.
Well, and who know you well enough to be like, you've written this better. This is not your A game. I've seen it. It's not this.
And also, as you're probably observing, the laughter, I think, is probably part of tool construction as well.
I guess one question that's kind of emerging out of this, and I think like conceptually, I think of like quick and dirty. I think Delphia, you've alluded to this, but before you're also talking about precision, right? And I think like when I imagine those 2 concepts, I don't see them overlapping, but a lot of what you're talking about is that they do. And I guess could you kind of dig into that further of like how this quick and dirty and precision is actually in some ways really aligned, and how that kind of process emerges?
Yeah. So So I don't think of them as overlapping so much as complementary, right? So in some ways, this is a little bit of my way of getting myself, bootstrapping myself to a precise place, is because at first, like, Mallory has the ability. I always think of, why are you laughing?
Just waiting to see what you're going to say.
Yeah, I know. This is quick. Stop the interview. No, Mallory has the ability to like work through so much of this in her head. Right. And so she's able to not only conceptually be precise, but articulate it in really important, like nuanced ways, in a way that it takes me both longer and a different process to get there. And so for me, I need that immediate feedback to be like, oh, here is the thing. I mean, and both, of course, are equally valid and whatnot, but I need and want that feedback in part because part of what I like about the research process is interacting with people and seeing what didn't work. And so I think Mallory is just able to conceptualize that better in her brain. I don't know if that you can agree with this, Mallory, but for me, the quick and dirty is a way to get to the level of precision that I need to do something really good. But that because I would otherwise get hung up on perfectionism, this is my way of like getting past that, if that makes sense. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah.
Mallory, you have anything?
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know. I don't know that that's exactly how I would have described it, but I see what you mean. I do think it's true. I think you and I, in some ways, have very compatible work styles, but in other ways have very distinctive work styles. And you're absolutely right that I do very much internalize things that I'm thinking about, and then it's just like it kind of comes, here's the thing I want to do.
Yes.
And I think one of the things that I really valued about working on this project with you is there were definitely a few times where I felt like I had to much better learn how to clearly articulate to someone who is not in my head what I am trying to convey.
Wait, I'm very curious about where you're going with this now, Mallory.
No, but I mean, I think there were definitely points in the process. In fact, I remember one of them. I remember sitting in one of the libraries at Cornell and like trying to work through, I think at this point, part of a draft. And I think you actually got a little frustrated with me and were like, you need to stop and sort of take a pause and like, tell me what you are trying to do instead of just like saying the words that you want us to type. Right. And it's like, I think it's one of the things that I like really value working with you, right, is that we, because of the slight differences in the way we go about work, I think like we ended up actually with a much better product than either of us would have gotten on our own, because we were both bringing like good things to the table and also forcing the other a little out of their comfort zone in some ways. But one of the benefits of working with someone who you're genuinely good friends with is you can do that.
Yeah.
Without, like, in a way that is productive and, you know, like doesn't make people not want to work together again. Hopefully, I don't know. We'll see if there's a third project.
Yeah. But if there isn't, that is not proof we're Mallory, I think you're right in that I just appreciate that our relationship has not been transactional about this. You know, that I think, our relationship has very much been, I think, in some ways defined by the fact that we were not stuck, but in the same B11 together. I know, I'm so sorry. In B11 together for 4 years or something like that, and doing research, but then also has definitely transcended that, and it has both smoothed the edges of moments where I think there's some intellectual discord or something like that, or disagreement or fluster, but at the same time, and you and I were talking about this, there have been these moments where we're like, oh, because we're really good friends, we know what's going on in your life. So let's just, I mean, did we mention the original data was collected in 2016? There have been times in our lives when we're like, oh, we know you're going through a lot. Let's just put it off. Or like, we would have a trip to work on this, and then it turns out, maybe something comes up, or like we would rather spend time together as friends. But it got published. Bottom line, it got published.
So I guess this has been the undercurrent of this whole interview so far, but what would you kind of recommend to young scholars? Is there kind of particular advice to going about this academic lifestyle?
There's so many things. I mean, I will say this with co-authorship in particular, and this is something I talk about with my grad students. I was fortunate in grad school to do some collaborative work with other faculty, and that was incredibly valuable, and I learned a lot. But in a lot of ways, the most, I think, I have learned the most, I think, both about myself as a scholar and like felt like I developed the most in co-authorships with peers, right? So when I was in grad school, co-authoring with other, at the time, grad students, right? We've kind of moved on, like, was immensely valuable. And now, right, co-authoring with other people who are sort of at a similar stage career-wise has just been incredibly valuable to me. I also think, particularly as a grad student, it is a smart strategic decision for the job market. But I think, so I think collaborating with people who are sort of at your career stage and your intellectual peers in that way is something I cannot recommend enough. That's a big one. The other thing I would say, Delphia and I were talking about this earlier, this is maybe less specific to co-authoring, but just sort of the general. I think, she was talking a little bit about, particularly after grad school, there are times where we would set aside to work on things, but, we would spend some of that time catching up because we don't live in the same place anymore. Like there was value to sort of maintaining relationships, not for the sake of having a co-authored piece get published. And I do think it's part of a sort of larger set of choices. I think when I was in grad school, I made a lot of choices about what I spent my time doing. And I spent a lot of time doing research and, learning and taking classes and things like that. But I also spent a lot of time doing other things that I cared about that were part of a sort of larger professional development, right? So I did a lot of teaching. I spent 2.5 years doing writing tutoring outside of my department, right, as a totally separate program. Those things took time away from my ability to get work published. And like there are trade-offs to those choices, right, that affected, what it meant to go on the job market and sort of like the kind of meandering route I took to get where I am now. They're not trade-offs that I regret having made at all, but they are trade-offs. And I would advise any sort of younger version of myself or anyself just to be realistic about those, right? Do the things that feel right to you and good to you and productive to you that are going to make you happy and feel like you're doing the kind of work you want to be doing, but be realistic with yourself about what the trade-offs are around making those choices. Mm-hmm. And a similar piece of that, a lot of folks I think in our discipline do like have a fairly, not necessarily narrow, but like a discrete and identifiable focus, right? I'm a Congress scholar or I'm an interest group scholar. I have never had that. Like, I tend to study things that I'm interested in. I can tell you how I think they fit together, right? I think they're about American political economy and inequality. But they're sometimes a little harder to frame. And that's a trade-off. Like, are you easily sort of diagnosable and recognizable and legible as a particular type of scholar or not? For me, I care more about asking the things that I'm most interested in, even if they don't all fit together cleanly. But that is a trade-off, and it creates challenges, at points that you have to figure out how to navigate. So I think that's what I would say is like, think about what are the trade-offs for the choices you're making, and are you going to feel good about those at the end of the day?
Yeah. Well, and I think sort of building on that, Mallory, I think, yes, it's important to think critically about the trade-offs that you're making. But I think in some ways, graduate school is actually, scratch literally everything I just said at the first half of that sentence. Graduate school is your life, and it is in many ways what your life is going to look like afterwards, right? So if you are interested in the teaching and the things that are not just purely a research or a very narrow focus, then great. That's who you are. I think in some ways I spent 10 and just say, great, working with where I am instead of trying to, let me back that up. I spent 10 years working first and then went back to graduate school. And I think in many ways, like Mallory, I made a lot of choices and I knew the trade-offs that I was making, but I think I also wasted a lot of emotional energy wondering why I needed to explain things that I thought were really important. Shouldn't everyone just think they were really important? And Mallory, I don't know if you'd agree with this, but I don't know that you spent any of that energy that I did. I was like, why doesn't everyone care about this thing? I shouldn't have to explain it to you. And you were like, oh, I don't even know if you asked why doesn't everyone care. You're just like, oh, I'm going to explain it. I'm going to make it matter. Right. And so I think that where we spend our emotional energy in terms of the need to justify our choices was very different in some important ways. And I think you're absolutely right to say, recognize the trade-offs, but then maybe don't spend any energy being like, why isn't the system different? Instead being like, okay, if this is my goal and these are my choices, how do I work within that framework instead of spending time wishing it were different?
Yeah. And it's hard to do.
Oh, yeah.
I think graduate school, by definition, right? You are at a PhD granting department. You are in an R1 institution, and the faculty you're working with, like, that's their life and that's their focus. And
yes. And as it should be.
Yeah, as it should be. But like it is hard, I think, to be in a space where there is a perception about the thing that is most valuable. And it's hard if you're like, well, I actually think there are many things that are valuable. It's hard, I think, not to at points feel like, you know, am I making the right choice? Or like, why doesn't everyone else think this is valuable, right? I mean, I will say, I think we were both fortunate that at least with respect to the asking big questions, not putting yourself in a box, like Cornell was a really great department to be in because they encouraged that.
Yeah.
But, you know, with respect to some of the other things, like it is hard, I think, to say, like, here are the things that I want to do.
Mm-hmm.
They're not necessarily like what everyone else in my cohort is trying to do. And, you know, I think that's doubly true for folks who want to go on, take a non-academic route. But yeah, I think it's hard. And you can spend a lot of emotional energy, like worrying about, are you making the right choices?
Yeah. Which, I mean, it goes without saying, but I do think it is worth being explicit about the fact that research can also is also just very emotional, right? Like you sort of constantly are thinking like, is this going to turn into anything? Or I am, Mallory, I don't know if you are, but that there's a certain amount of managing emotions. So I think it is worth addressing as part of the research process, at least in this stage.
And I see kind of an interesting conversation that's coming out of this of like, you are in a top-down system, right? There's some things you have to achieve to get through it. But then there's obviously your own interests, right? So there's some middle ground, as kind of both of you have talked about at this point of, well, what are the trade-offs? What are you actually signing up for? And I guess, do you have recommendations on how to navigate that, how to balance? I think, Delphia, you had talked about like, what do you want to do and what you have to do? I mean, I think that's a dilemma. I can say for myself that I've gone through it, obviously, at this point. So, like, are there kind of principles or kind of general questions to ask yourself when navigating that? I'm just curious if you kind of have any recommendations in that squishy middle ground that I think almost all PhD students kind of find themselves in.
Yeah. Go ahead, Mallory.
No, I was thinking about, I think some of the answer to that question depends on your risk tolerance.
Yeah.
So I think, Delphia, I think you would probably agree with this, at least in a professional sense. I have a reasonably high risk tolerance, and though I certainly question a reasonably high level of confidence that I will make something work.
That is an important gap, right? There's a big difference. The confidence piece is an important second step for the risk tolerance. Go on.
Yeah. No, but I think it's true, right? I think that, and obviously it gets easier the longer you're in a field, right? It's easier to be more confident when you're more secure, when you've been doing something longer and you kind of know what you're doing more. But I do think those are important. And so, I think, I think there is some combination of how much tolerance for risk do you have? How much variation, how many things do you think you can be happy doing, right? Yeah. So is there only one type of job you want? Well, then you probably need to make the choices that are going to get you as close to that as you can. If you can imagine yourself doing different things and being happy, then you probably have some more flexibility in the choices that you make. Are you someone who feels like do you feel reasonably confident sort of owning the choices you make, and whatever happens, well, then you're going to make different choices than if you don't. And I don't think any of those are better or worse. I just think we all have to recognize who we are as people and make choices accordingly. I think that's really hard to do in grad school, both because you don't really know what's going on. Everything is new, and people are telling you that there's one particular way of doing things. One of the things that I really valued about Suzanne Mettler as an advisor is that I don't think she did that, right? I don't think she ever stepped in and said there is one way of doing things. She was kind of okay, well, these are the things you're doing, and let's talk about how to make those work. And, was very supportive. And so, yeah, I don't know that any of that is advice, but I think, I guess the advice is be honest with yourself about who you are as a person and make choices that are not going to create additional anxiety and stress for you because you're trying to do something that, it doesn't fit with what you're comfortable with.
Yeah, Mallory, that's a good answer. I would like to rewind and give that answer. I also think it is really important, finding, if not mentors, people whom you would like to have their life, and or a life like theirs, and learning how did they do that, right? How do they negotiate the emotional, intellectual, social, financial journey that is graduate school and potentially an academic career or not afterwards? Because I think without seeing a path forward, it is hard to know what all of your options are, and then to have confidence that it's going to be okay for you. I do think that's really challenging, because you do tend to be sort of surrounded by not one model, but a particular model at certainly at an R1 of the relative role of things. And so I think sometimes that involves going to other departments. I think sometimes that involves going to other institutions. I think not being afraid to reach out and ask people to talk. And it doesn't even have to be at a conference, right? A Zoom or something is fantastic. And of course, if you read something that's interesting to you and you're oh, this matters, reaching out to the authors and saying can I have time for coffee or a Zoom or something is a good idea. I don't know, Mallory, how you feel about that, but
yeah, no, 100% agree.
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I think once you find scholarship that you're this speaks to me, then that is a sign that that there's a pathway forward for the scholarship, right? That you have a path, a way you can go, and then that maybe those are your people.
Yeah. And I would say, it's been interesting to me, for all that we have, I think you learn in grad school, there are particular ways that things are done, or there are particular types of scholarship that are valued. it has been my experience, and maybe this says more about the people who I spend time with, I don't know. It has been my experience that the things that, even if we're just thinking about publications, the things that in some ways have been the least traditional scholarship that I've done have almost always been the thing that I hear the most back from people that are like, oh, I love that. I'm so glad you did it. Like our other piece together, which was more descriptive and qualitative and kind of pulling things together. Like, and people are like, oh, I really like that. Or, you know, Jamila Mishner and I had a piece that was entirely descriptive about tenant organizing and politics, that we were kind of like, I don't know if anybody's going to want to read this. And the number of people who have reached out to say, this is so valuable. Or like the perspectives piece that we did with Chloe Thurston on sort of bottom-up scholarship, which was a weird piece to write in a lot of ways. The number of people have been like, I'm so glad you wrote that. Like, and actually the number of grad students who have said, I'm so glad you wrote that because now I can cite that and justify doing the qualitative work that I want to do.
Yeah.
So I think it is often those things that feel like a bigger risk at the time that end up being the most rewarding that you do. Obviously, it's not always going to come out that way, but I think it's worth it.
Yeah. And I would echo that, although my research agenda looks substantially less, I think, traditional than yours does, Mallory, in terms of doing community engaged work and advocacy work at the state level.
Yeah, but you find so much value in that, don't you?
Oh,
because like, the work
100%.
you're doing, like,
oh my God, yes.
Organizations' ability to get grants and
yes,
like, happening in the Arkansas prison system.
Yes, absolutely, like 100%. But it doesn't look like I'm not publishing in a lot of political science journals. I'm doing a lot of policy work and writing and brief writing and grant writing and advocacy work at the state level in areas I really care about. And I'm at an institution that supports that. And I mean, I would not trade it for anything. I am so thankful I have the opportunity to be here. But part of that also was me recognizing in graduate school, like, I am not an R1 person. Like, and I'm all, that is just, that is not going to be, I'm not going to be a happy person if my main focus needs to be strictly academic research. Not that yours is, Mal. I know that you have other things. I'm just
saying.
No,
there's a reason I landed at a policy school, because they value public engagement, right?
Yeah. So.
Well, as we come up on the hour, I just want to say thanks to both of you. Great conversation, a great, I think, kind of depiction of different ways you can go about kind of the career as an academic and kind of approaches to doing research as well. I think it's been a kind of great discussion of different approaches. But with that, as we kind of wrap up here, are there last comments, last thoughts, last pieces of advice that either of you have?
I would say I do think the value in developing good co-author relationships is so high. Like, Delphia and I have worked on a couple of things together at this point, and like we mentioned, right, have this sort of ongoing like workshopping relationship, and it's just so valuable. I mean, obviously it helps to have co-authors who you like hanging out with, but it's been just such an incredibly valuable, I think, experience to have those relationships with co-authors and collaborators who you can work with over time and develop a professional relationship with, and the ideas and the methods and all of that stuff is stronger and richer and better for having those relationships. So find good co-authors.
I was gonna say a version of that, which is work with people who are different than you, and see that as a compliment rather than as maybe a challenge or something like that. Like, I think finding good people who are smart in ways you are not as familiar, or it doesn't come as naturally to you, can be incredibly rewarding and really fantastic.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Mallory. Thank you, Delphia. I appreciate your time that you have spent with me over this last hour. And as we wrap up, I just want to thank both the Policy Studies Journal and the Center of Policy Design and Governance at Syracuse University, for which this podcast is a joint initiative. And with that, again, thank you for spending your time with us, and we'll see you next quarter.